Charles Sanders was born, therefore, Charles Sanders Peirce was born in 1839 and lived up to 1914. Uh, Peirce was considered very often an eccentric kind of thinker. He was by himself most of the time. But he was definitely very genius. Very little known about him even today, because many of his thoughts remains even obscure in a certain sense. Um, there are people who thought, however, who have read Peirce, that some of the contributions of Peirce is as great as Aristotle or Leibniz, and the influence will be very greatly felt. Peirce cannot be just captured into one or the other dimensions of his philosophical thinking, because Peirce has almost contributed to every field, varying from philosophy of science to mathematics, even to some extent, psychology, philology, and so on and so forth. But however, his contributions are mainly to science, mathematics, and philosophy. And some of his ideas predated many of those philosophers who came with similar ideas much later than him, and Peirce is not known as much as they are known. For example, when you speak about mathematical logic, people normally think of Frege or Gottlob. But much before them, Peirce has contributed to mathematical logic. Or when you speak about semiotics, if you are a linguistic student, if you do semiotics, the person that comes to your mind is obviously de Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure. But even before Ferdinand de Saussure, Peirce has contributed to this field of semiotics. Even when people discuss about pragmatism, the most often cited person is William James with this The Variety of Religious Experience, the book that has influenced many successive generations. But this very idea of pragmatism is not so much of the origin of William James, but of Peirce himself. Even the idea of phenomenology and so on, which we will discuss later, even before Husserl, some of his interpreters think that Peirce had this in his writings. He also had a lot of discoveries in science and mathematics, and I don't need to get into that. But Peirce considered himself primarily as a logician and a semiotician. In other words, his achievements are primarily because of a certain way in which he has developed to a method to think. Now, to give you a simple idea what this method of thinking would imply, he has a nice statement in one of his essays called How to Make Our Ideas Clear, which was published in 1878. I quote him here. He says, "The very first lesson that we have a right to demand that logic shall teach us is how to make our ideas clear." Now, this is what we need to demand. This is our right to demand. What logic should teach us is how to make our ideas clear. And after a few sentences, he continues saying, "To know what we think, to be masters of our own meaning, will make a solid foundation for great and weighty thought." So, this idea is further enunciated by Peirce in terms of pragmatism. So he would say, how do I be master of my own meaning? That I know what I think, is to know the practical bearing of what I think. So his own words, I will quote again: "Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object." In other words, what we conceive as an object is nothing other than the effects that the particular object has in terms of its practical use or practical value. That's all it is. So you need to consider what kind of effects this particular concept of a thing has for my practical life. So obviously that is the starting of pragmatic thinking. Now, this particular view that what we conceive as to be determined by the practical effects is of a great importance to understand the world around us. Otherwise, it becomes very, very abstract kind of thinking. The concept that you have will have an abstract kind of thinking. For example, when you see a bread, people may look at very differently whatever it is, but the point of the matter is, you are not looking at the bread from the point of view of any abstraction. You are looking at what this bread mean to me, what way it can be of a practical help to me. Now, what is about bread is an object of use. When if it is something else, it is not an object of use, what kind of value it has for me, practically, in my life. So then that will give what the concept of that particular thing is. Now, you remember that we have discussed a school called Positivism. This is developed in Austria, in particular in the city called Vienna, often denoted as Vienna Circle, which later also gave rise to the whole lot of philosophy of language, including Wittgenstein's, and a certain philosophy of science like Peirce. I don't know whether you are familiar with any of these things, but it doesn't matter if you are not. But all these things are influenced by this idea of Peirce, meaning to say what you conceive, you can depend. That what you conceive should always be the conception of the effects of what you conceive and how it practically affects you. So this came to be known as what is known as a pragmatic maxim, something that is foundational to the American pragmatism. Now, Peirce gives a very clear, precise definition, which are also equally interesting. For him, semiotics simply means the study of signs. Often signs are also related to symbols. They are interchangeably used, but there is a difference. Of course, Peirce brings the idea of signs very clearly. We do speak about sign in everyday, we interpret signs all the time when we speak. Word is a sign, concept is a sign. So, for him, semiotics, the study of signs, is the basic of all knowledge. So, the reason is because humans are capable of reasoning about certain things which are very, very loaded terms, such as truth. This is possible because we generate and interpret signs, without which we cannot really make any reasoning about such loaded terms. So the question that Peirce was interested is how we know things. So knowledge, language, and in fact the whole of nature derive from signs. Now, for him, each sign is a three-dimensional aspect. It has a three function. Let us put that way. The sign as an object. Now, when you see about an object, it doesn't literally mean a physical object, something that is there in that sense is an object. It has a form, and it has an interpretation. Now, if you look at the traffic signs, for example, you see, for example, if there is a particular, let's say, what traffic sign that we often encounter. Okay, for example, in a particular way, you cannot overtake. There is a sign which is there. That is the object that you see. The overtake. There will be two arrows, one next to the other, and it will be barred, for example. Or no parking. I mean, these are things that you see very often on the streets. There is a particular sign. Now, that very object itself is a kind of sign, but it has a form. The form is, for example, different traffic signals will have a different form. Some will be rectangular, some will be octagon, Some will be square, it has a sign and it has certain image or letters even printed on it. But then this particular form that we notice as a particular interpretation. So you have a logical interpretation, or the mental interpretation that you have to do as it is said. I cannot overtake now, or I should not park here. See, the object is the command for you to follow a particular rule, traffic rule. Let's say if there is a stop sign, it is a command for you to stop. The form connects the object. The object is the command to stop, is that object itself in this case. And then the form connects the object and the interpretation and is a particular form which the particular object gives you. So, particular in this case, it is the sign itself. What you see there. Like for example, if it is no parking or no stop, whatever it is. Now, also suppose if you notice, for example, now I am sitting here and then I notice suddenly thick black cloud forming. So, what is that? It is a sign. It's a sign of the possibility of rain. And this is further interpreted by the fact that there is gentle breeze, there is the trees that are kind of they are becoming this season monsoon, they look rather green and thick green and so on. And this is a preparation for a kind of the season of monsoon in this case, obviously. Not only just the rain that is imminent, but also the whole of season, for example, that you can think of. So you see there is going to be something seasonal here, which is seen by the clouds, which is also alongside interpreted by the other factors that you observe there. And then you conclude that this is the monsoon. So when people discuss the connections between language and knowledge, especially the possible existence of language in other species than human, we keep asking this question: now, how do they communicate? That's for me a fascinating question. How do they really understand each other? What kind of language they really use? They somehow communicate. So they understand each other in some way. The communication language, thinking and human language more generally. So people normally appeal to concepts such as symbol and sign. A few years later, after Peirce's idea of the semiotics, Saussure invented his own theory of signs. He also called it semiotics. But then it didn't have much of a resemblance to Peirce's work. In fact, both of them use the same Greek word, which they followed from the British philosopher John Locke of 17th century. Semeion could mean a sign, but it also can mean a miracle. Okay, something out of the way, something that doesn't follow the regular law of nature, for example. That would be a miracle. Be that as it may, Saussure had a much more better understanding than Peirce has a better understanding than Saussure, only because some people think there is a particular place for symbols in Peirce's understanding, whereas symbols do not have much of a place in Saussure's theory. In fact, Saussure almost interchangeably uses symbol and sign, so they are one and the same in different ways. So Saussure did not have a special place, in his theory for symbols. Now, Peirce, on the other hand, his definition is clear, formal, precise, and then Peirce's theory of signs recognizes three foundational types of signs, and therefore three components to each of these signs. There are three types of signs, and to each of these, in each of these three types of signs, there are three components. In the first place, according to Peirce, a sign requires signaling form to link an object with an interpretation. You need a form that would link an object to an interpretation, and this form is what signals the link. It informs you the link. Now let us think about this. Now, when you see, for example, smoke, you would say this is a, now when you see the smoke, immediately you interpret there is some fire somewhere. So smoke is a sign of fire. Now what links the smoke, what you see is the smoke, which is the form. What links the smoke to the fire is your mind, because there is an interpretation that happens in your mind, and this interpretation is enabled by the smoke. It is the smoke that signals the link to fire, which is the object, and mind makes the interpretation. So Peirce argued for three foundational signs called icons, indexes, and symbols. Now, an icon is a sign that is structurally isomorphic in some way. In other words, it typically resembles its object. So that is an icon. You know, a photography, for example. It's an icon, or a painting which represents the person. You know, that would be an icon. So it resembles its object. So the icon is not the same as the object. For example, you have this Ganesh Chaturthi now, right? You make an so it's an icon. It's a kind of representation of that divine being called Ganapati. It's not Ganapati per se, but it's a representation, iconic. But then it is resembling the original Ganapati. Well, we don't know about how he looked, but at least from what we have read and so on, this is how we have come to. Okay, an index is a sign that is physically connected to its object. May not be in a very strict sense, but at least loosely, but it is physically connected. Now, the example I gave is obviously smoke and fire. There is a physical connection between smoke and fire. Or, for example, to fragrance and roses or flowers in general. There is a physical connection here. Or pointing physically towards an object, for example. So that is why our finger is called the index finger. That finger by which you point to something. There is a connection that you make, that is sign. In that sense, it is an index. Finally, a symbol is always, almost, if not every, it's not always, a cultural convention that all objects of a cultural type are to be referred to by a particular form and interpreted in a particular way. Now, we all have this, we have a certain thing, within a cultural society, it may not be everywhere. So in a given society, you may, for example, for the Chinese, dragon is something very auspicious, for example. Now, however fictitious that creature is, but it is something auspicious. Now, in the Western society, unfortunately, dragon is something that is evil. Now, it is a cultural convention. Okay, they are referred to a particular form and interpreted in a particular way. So, many of these things, for example, dog, for example, in certain cultures, obviously, is much, is a part of your family, for example. It's almost a member of the family. In other societies, dogs is a wonderful meat, maybe. So the way it is, this is the third dimension, which is a cultural type, which is a convention that a culture creates. So this is a symbol. So a symbol is always something that is, whether there is something there can be a natural symbol. I don't think a person would accept in that, say whatever you think as natural is something that across cultures happen to be sometimes same. In some cultures, for example, water, people would say stands for purity. Well, this is because over a period of your experience, in every cultural group, you see water cleans you, and therefore you construct that as a symbol of purity. Water also can be a symbol of destruction in some way, because if your experience is very powerfully constituted by flood all the time, that destroys people and so on. Now, if we take this way of Peirce, these three dimensions, three kinds of signs, types of signs like icons, indexes, and symbols, then the other species, other than human, they cannot probably possess the symbols because they don't have the question of culture, generally as we understand, that exists within the human life, and therefore they may not have the ability to generalize a certain experience that they have together as a cultural society. Now, this distinction of signs has been influential because we see confusion throughout the literature on what a symbol is. So therefore, this is definitely, now for Peirce, symbol is a cultural construct, a cultural convention. So symbols oftentimes people confuse with so many things and so on. Now this offers a clarity in that sense. Okay. Now to give another simple example, if you today, to give a distinction between the index and symbol, one of the things that people speak about behavioral psychology, people talk about conditioning, isn't it? If you are a psychology major, you must be aware of that. A dog can be conditioned by the sound of the bell that it is food time. So the moment the dog hears the bell, the dog knows that food is going to be served. Now people say therefore bell is symbolic of food, but from Peirce's point of view, no, bell is not a symbol of food, but it is merely an index of food. It's only pointing out, it's taking connection between the bell and the food, just like the smoke and the fire. The smoke and fire is a natural one. Here, of course, it is artificially construed, but it has nothing to do with a cultural convention. It has no symbolic character for that matter. You see, therefore, you cannot think of there is anything like a dog culture or anything. There is no such thing. The dog is conditioned that way. In another person tries to do it differently to make that index, connection between food and something else, then that would be the case. Some families I have seen, for example, my own pet, when I had her, every time when I pick up her bowl, she knows it is for food. She will come and stand there. I never ring a bell. So this is merely an index. It sees a connection between its plate and the food. So simple as that. So it is not anything to do with symbol in that sense. So therefore, Peirce definitely is making a very clear distinction of the three types, namely the icon. The icon is the mere representation, and the index is the physical connection that something has to something, and symbol, which is almost always a cultural convention. So this is an important ways in which he has contributed to this field of semiotics. Now to go further, for Peirce, humans know all things in one of three ways. Now what do we mean by one of three ways? To understand this, he gives the first way, second way, and third way. Okay, what is the first way? The first way is the initial impression. For example, an icon is a sign of this firstness. So when I see something immediately that resembles something, is similar to something, that is the initial impression. Secondness is a clearer perception of the distinctive features of the object. So here obviously, you are not just going by the first impression, just like the icon, just mere representation and so on. You begin to note there are distinctive features of the object, there are contrasts, you can compare with another experience of perception. You see there is a resistance of one object to another, etc. So in these things, the object becomes clearer. So therefore an index is a sign of secondness. Meaning to say, it is only by able to distinguish it from other things that I am able to realize this is pointing to this. This has a physical connection to this. So smoke and fire, for example, so you are saying how the fire is contrasted with water or wind and so on, and therefore there is an ability to the individual identity becomes clearer in this contrast, in this comparison. So that's what it means by in index. That's what it happens. Only when I am able to generalize something, then I reach the thirdness. Therefore, symbols are the third kind, or the thirdness of the signs. So the firstness, secondness and thirdness are crucial, according to him, to all signs. For example, in linguistics, the analysis of sound system requires each of these three ways of seeing. The first way of seeing, which is iconic, the second way of seeing, the indexing, and the third way of seeing, which is symbolic. Now, in the analysis of sound also, you have all these three things. A sound is first recognized for its physical characteristics. Now, when I say physical characteristic, sound doesn't have a physical form, but it doesn't have something, a characteristic of audition. In that sense, a physical characteristic. It's not the formal one, but in terms of it's audition. Only by opposing this sound to other sounds, we can begin to clearly understand this sound. Now that is the second, obviously. The first is just recognizing some physical characteristic of it. So that is how the children learn the sounds of their first language, right? So it begins to make distinction between, for example, P and B, or the T and D, for example. All these things are in terms of this contrast. So from the initial firstness of a particular sound, now in the secondness there is a clearness with regard to the sound because of the comparison and contrast with other sounds which may sound similar, but they are not same. And there is a whole way in which the linguistics develops. So Peirce embedded his idea about science into even a larger system. The larger system of architectonic included and classified all of the sciences. Now the architectonic includes not only Peirce's most famous contributions such as pragmatism and semiotics, but also more specific contributions to different fields he made. In fact, he included all of science into that ultimately. Another important contribution of Peirce is this idea of fallibilism, meaning to say that we can never guarantee truth for any beliefs. In other words, it's a simple recognition we are fallible, we are not infallible. Why is fallibilism important? Because it means that no matter how much evidence we have collected, the fact that our knowledge proceeds by experience would imply that knowledge grows by induction. And induction does not guarantee that the data that probably we would have sometime in the future would not show that we are mistaken. So it is still possible the data, we don't have the data yet, but once that kind of data is still possible. I mean, science grows by that, we know that. So, you know, the famous theory of Karl Popper, falsification, is based on this idea of fallibilism, because Karl Popper said science grows by falsification, not just by verification. It's not that by verifying that this what we hold to be true that it progresses, but by falsifying what we hold to be true as well it progresses. And that is why that is the best way in which science can progress. That's how one theory replaces the other theory, because you find suddenly an anomaly in the previous theory you try to somehow see and then find that theory is wrong in fact. Then you come up with a new theory. I mean, it goes on and on. There hasn't been any guarantee that you have got the perfect answer yet. So, inquiry into a community activity, and it is unbounded by time. Inquiry therefore is a community activity, and it has no, cannot be bounded by time in principle. And this has been, this has influenced tremendously the philosophy of science. You know, Kuhn, for example, Thomas Kuhn, is that science is a community activity. And it has no time limit. You cannot say it gets over at this period of time, because there will be another group of people who will replace you and they'll go on. So truth is whatever the community of inquirers would agree to be the case by the end of inquiry. Well, by the end of inquiry would imply here almost, you know, there's no end, because it will go on. So, because every time the community of inquirers would come up with something different. Now, this doesn't mean Peirce is denying the existence of truth. I mean, that's not the question here. So, Peirce, all that he says is that we need to, philosophers should be humble enough to accept that the idea that all knowledge has to be subjected to revision. So, you cannot be very absolutistic, you cannot be dogmatic. That is very arrogant. I mean, I fully would agree with Peirce on this thing. This is a very great insight I think Peirce had given much before his time. Today, of course, the 20th century, many people, you know, 20th, 21st century, obviously, many people have taken it well, but at that time, in the 19th century, this was not well seen for that matter. It was still a time when triumphalism was there, even scientific triumphalism was there. And now this, what he says about science can be applied to everything, culture, religion, morality. You know, this is, I think, very, very crucial for us today, so that we don't absolutize, we don't dogmatize things. We remain open-ended, we remain open-minded in that sense. So, Peirce also thought a lot about the question of chance in life, based on the idea of Darwin, or Darwinism to be more precise. So, chance is fundamental to the universe, and it permeates science, philosophy, and everything else. In other words, you know, it's like a game of dice. You know, you have a, I mean, you may get, you know, I don't know how many of you play dice. I don't know whether that exists even now. I think it exists in mobile app, I think, because somebody told me, you know, would you like to play dice with me? I said, how? It's in a mobile app or something like that. Okay, anyway, that's a cool thing. You know, the dice is, you know, you just throw the thing, and then you have the different numbers that comes, and accordingly move the position of your piece in the game. So that is, you know, it's not, you have a chance either to get 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 or 1, whatever it is. It's just that. So that is the question of chance. So life is dependent on, in a certain way, randomness. So in this sense, obviously, the whole question of uncertainty, which later scientists like Heisenberg has pointed out as a place, you see. Much before Heisenberg came with the uncertainty principle, because randomness is part and parcel of life. You cannot explain everything very clearly. In other words, the whole idea that everything has a purpose, it has a teleological end towards which we move, etc., seems to be quite far-fetched. Well, it's comfortable thinking that way, It's very reassuring. Um, you know, because we can to some extent be comforted by the fact, well, if this happens, there's a logical series. You know, who doesn't like logical series? All of us like logical series, don't we? If there is something very random about it, we are really worried. We are because there is nothing certain about it. So that really creates a lot of anxiety in us. But the fact of the matter is, we need to learn to embrace this randomness. Things are not all that certain that it might be. It's like, when will this coronavirus end? Nobody knows. Would it end at all? We don't know. Yet we need to learn to embrace this. I mean, probably that is how life is, about this randomness. Another important idea of Peirce is a famous doctrine of what is known as Sinakism. Sinakism is basically, I'm sure you know this word. It's synergy and so on comes from this word. I will type this nevertheless because I am not using any PowerPoint. Okay. You see, it only means that everything in the universe is connected. You cannot see anything in isolation. Not just the people, but also everything. So he has a beautiful statement. So I think I will read that entire quote. That's quite interesting. Yeah. In 1893, he said this in a paper called "Immortality in the Light of Sinakism." Nor much any Sinakist say, I am altogether myself, and not at all you. If you embrace Sinakism, you must observe the metaphysics of wickedness. In the first place, your neighbors are, in a measure, yourself, and in far greater measure than, without deep studies in psychology, you would believe. Really, the selfhood you like to attribute to yourself is for the most part the vulgarest delusion of vanity. I mean, that's a beautiful statement. The selfhood you like to attribute to yourself is for the most part the vulgarest delusion of vanity. In other words, you cannot think of yourself completely in isolation. This is again, I mean, I'm just connecting to our practical context today. Many, thinkers during this coronavirus became aware of the fact that how much we are connected. And then you cannot protect yourself, when others are not protected. Your protection is possible only when others are equally protected as you are. However, it played out very awkwardly in the society with all our little ego and selfishness and the disparity that we have in terms of economic system we have. People had to come to terms with this. I mean, they had to because they cannot simply say it's your problem, I don't care. No, it also becomes my problem. When somebody falls sick, it is also my issue. It is not that person's issue alone. That is why the society became, to be mobilized. It's not that, some people here and there. Otherwise, who else cared with other things? It was a powerful reminder. Somehow we are all connected. So, therefore, it is very important. We cannot do anything single-handedly, all by ourselves, etc. We need everybody else. We are journeying together. We are co-pilgrims. And even when it comes to, for example, even why the virus was provoked. I mean, though there is no clear answer, is it because we are kind of manipulating certain aspects and so on, or is it because of some things that is provoked in the ways that nature is destabilized? Even then, it only is a pointer to the fact that what you do would affect everybody else, and what I do would affect everybody else. In science, this came to be known later as what is known as the butterfly effect. I don't know whether you are aware of that. The butterfly that flutters its wings in somewhere in the western hemisphere can create a storm somewhere in the east. So everything seems to be very related. So if you want to live together, take the chance, of all the challenges that come before us. We should be aware of this fact that we are interconnected. Peirce's influence today, I mean, of course, his influence is also equally in logic. I'm not going to speak about that much. It is his influence is everywhere now, as you can see how we can interpret that into political theory, to aesthetics, to rhetoric, to ethics, and so on. But that you can on your own can assess more about it. Be that as it may, his influence is seen in many of the writings today, and many books that came after him. So we cannot ignore his particular approach to pragmatism, particularly his contribution to science and the three types of science and all the ideas that are related to that particular question, including the question of the Eichen index symbol, and finally, as I told you, uh, how that can be applied also into the question of what is known as you know um, in our language, uh, in linguistics, and also the question of how we are all connected, how this idea has also influenced the successive philosophers of science in the 20th century. I think with that I shall end this lecture, and then probably if you have questions I will take that up. Thank you.